Let's start with the beginning. I was very sensationally and very publicly fired from my job as the editor-in-chief of Vogue last year. I'd been editor-in-chief of Vogue for 13 years. I'd been at Vogue for 25 and in the industry for 27. And as far as I thought, I was just approaching the peak of my powers. And then I was suddenly fired by a new CEO. I just want to add, I've had 8. She was my 8th. And I had only met her once. I had a very brief conversation with her for an hour, but was called up for my second meeting, told to leave the building. Told to leave the building immediately, not to say goodbye to my staff that I'd worked with for 13 years. I mean, my EA was like my little sister. I ring her every day because I don't know what to do without her, actually. But was told to leave the building. That's corporate life at the moment. That was corporate life under news. The press went to town because, missing the bigger picture, that I was probably one of the first high-profile editors that lost their job. But we've seen over the last year or so many journalists and editors being shown the door because of the precarious times in publishing. I mean, we're at such a state of change. But I was the most high-profile one. It's irresistible for people because I'm a woman. I was at Vogue. It's fashion, hoity-toity, pish-posh, champagne, kissing, airhead. Really easy for them to make fun of me. Losing my livelihood, I am the breadwinner in the family. I've lost a job that I loved. Staff were swept out afterwards. But they thought it was a great fun to make fun of it in the paper. It's something they actually reserve for fashion magazine editors, although I've noticed a couple of fashion magazines have actually closed since, and they didn't really get the treatment that I got. I think that was sort of reserved for a Vogue editor, weirdly. It is misogynistic. The journalists get to write, and they they were men and women. They got to write things like perfumed corridors of power, perfectly manicured blood-red nails, staff shaking in their Prada shoes. I wish they'd let me know because I would have written the press release. It would have been much better, and I could have just circulated it to all the papers. So the very next day after my termination, which you're sort of reeling a little bit, obviously, I was at a friend's house having a glass of champagne because I couldn't think of anything better to do than do that. And I got a telephone call from Melbourne University Press from an editor, who consequently became my editor, Sally Heath. And she said, "Have you thought about writing a book? You've been in the industry for 25 years. And I was still obviously in shock. I said, "Do you know what just happened to me though? I just got fired." She went, "Duh." And I was like, "Oh, yes." So Louise Adler, who was the CEO of Melbourne University Press, met with me 2 days later. We had breakfast. I liked her immediately. I liked the editor that had rung me. And I signed the deal straight away to do this book, which was my memoirs. I have to say, and Louise said to me, "This will be very cathartic for you," and it was. So even though I was in that fugue of a post-sacking, I felt immediately like I had a purpose and that I had a voice. I had something to do the next day, as opposed to people going, "What are you going to do now?" Because I got that question all the time. I was at Vogue as well. What are you going to do next? And you don't know when you're there. You're so caught up in doing it. It's such a great job. But I did decide that day, and I think the book deal helped, that I was not going to let how I was fired diminish what I'd done and not diminish my accomplishments or any of my experiences and not diminish me as a person. It's just part of regime change. People can do things the way they want to do them, but I refused, and I still do, and I shan't take it personally. And I think, I'm sure I'm not the only person in this room who's ever been fired, or it may happen to people in these weird times, but you have to take the personal power back and say it mustn't diminish what you achieved. Mostly these are just decisions about money. So I finished the book, which is the Vogue Factor, which is what I thought was really going to be a very personal story, and it is, but really it's a slice of publishing history and fashion industry, and I had to finish it in 5 months. So I had to be very disciplined about that. I went and wrote it at a friend's house because, my husband was getting under my feet. And I went every day for 6 hours and broke for lunch for 1 hour and just really disciplined myself 5 to 6 days a week to get that book out in 5 months because the story needed to be told when it was, new. I'll give you a nutshell of my journey to get to Vogue. I grew up in the Sutherland Shire in New South Wales, if anybody knows about the Shire. Puberty blues. I went to that school. I actually went to that high school. I loved that television show. Kathy Letton and Gabrielle Carey were a few years ahead of me, but that was certainly how it was. All I wanted to do was get out of the Shire, and a lot of great people do get out of the Shire. So when I was 16, 17, I moved into King's Cross and got my own apartment. I worked for stockbrokers, what have you, and went overseas and I travelled because what I was always really interested in was popular culture and travel and writing and reading. So it wasn't that I was a fashionista. I've never been a fashionista. I hate that term. If anybody ever came to get a job from me and was like, I've got a passion for fashion, I was like, I'm not hiring you, because fashion is just one thing. Fashion is part of loving film and books and theatre and culture and history and literature. I said literature and film. Fashion is a part of that. What I do see in some of that younger generation that come out, they have a passion for shopping, and it's a very different thing to making a magazine, making a beautiful magazine, or making some sort of publishing company that is talking about popular culture. It's far, far much more than labels. And when I was 17, I shopped vintage. We went at op shops. An 18-year-old says to me now, I like Alexander Wang. I'm like, I wouldn't even known that wouldn't have entered my consciousness to be so label aware. When I was 18 years old, we were punk and, and as I say, vintage and all that sort of following bands. And I think that's so important to inform you later on as an editor to have a bigger viewpoint. So it did a lot for my hiring over the years to see what people would say they were interested in. Eventually, I travelled overseas I was at stockbroking and over the halcyon years I kept getting bonuses for coming up with one small idea that they all thought was genius. So it was like, yay, I could go away, give you $10,000, you could go away for a year. I came back and I was working in a bookstore, and I think I'd read every book in the store, and there was an ad as the receptionist at Vogue, and I thought, I was 23, and I thought, what a world that would open up to work at Vogue, and I've always wanted to see behind closed doors, and that would be an amazing job. So I applied. I had to run up after the bookstore closed. I was the last person that this wonderful woman saw called Norma Mary Marshall, and she was probably in her mid-60s. She had white blonde hair. She was really beautiful, bright blue eyes, great legs, and she was drinking gin in a teacup. And I was like, I like you, and she liked me. And she said, oh, look, I've put a girl on for a week, so I'm going to try her out for a week, and then I'll try you out for the next week, and we'll see who's better. And I was very nervous, and I don't know what came over me, but I said, well, why don't you put me on first, because if I'm good, then you can just keep me. And she said, can you use a switchboard? And I said, of course I can, and I'd never used one in my life. And so she hired me, and I got there on the first day. I was 23, and it was male model casting day, and I thought, I'm never leaving. I'm just never going. And I didn't. Back at that time, there was just so many amazing women that worked at Vogue, just swishing past the desk, and really incredible, and Fleet Street journalists, and it was really the editor was an ex-Fleet Street journalist, and they were so stylish, and Vogue Entertaining was up and happening, which Martha Stewart consequently based her magazine on, really incredible people. And so I looked for mentors, and I did find mentors in there. I found an incredible mentor called Nancy Pilcher, who was the executive editor, and so she'd walk past the reception desk, and I was like, could I type your notes? Could I clean out the stocking drawer? Could I? And after 3 months, I said to her, if they ever give you an assistant, could I possibly be that person? So she made it happen for me, and I did many times over the years. For the next 10 years, I did 3 or 4 jobs at the same time because I could write. So I would assist Nancy, I would write all the captions and cover lines, I would do men's style menswear, I would do production, and I just made myself useful. So although I didn't really have any, training, it was just making yourself useful, putting your hand up and having a passion for the whole magazine, not just fashion, but wanting to know more about it and learn more about it. So I was there for 10 years. I moved up to the position of beauty director, I think it was, because when I was younger, I used to go up to Miranda Fair and sit out the front and wait for this magazine that came from the UK that had all these beauty products in it that I loved. And I was mad about this magazine. I'd sit outside when I was 10 or 11, freezing cold, waiting. And I never knew, who knew that there was such a job as beauty editor, where you get to make magazines and play with beauty products and consequently travel the world and have an amazing time. We were so naive then. And that was the job I ended up with, and it was fantastic. But I ended up moving to Paris. I was a foreign correspondent in Paris for 5 years, which I met my husband in Paris. I had my children in Paris. And that was fantastic. It was great to get out of, although I'd been at Vogue for 10 years, to go to Paris and stop being a big fish in a small pond, but actually go and learn from the ground up. Obviously learn the language, but in the morning I could interview Gianfranco Ferre, you have breakfast. At lunchtime I could interview the nose at Chanel. That evening I could have a drink with Tom Ford, like just that context. And of course I got to go to the shows because when I was a beauty editor, you didn't go to the shows as a beauty editor, money's tight. Only the fashion directors go. But I got to go to the shows, and that's where you really learn the ropes and you really feel part of what that industry is. You can't do it from afar and on the internet. You have to be there. And even better when you live there, you're getting the metro there with your sort of sodden shoes and you go in and Anna Wintour's sitting next to you and her feet haven't touched the ground from the limo. But you were the working journalist who felt, so happy to be there and so privileged. It was fantastic. So I think being in that beauty area as well taught me a lot about how I would eventually become editor, because there was a creative dance between beauty and content, because the beauty advertisers are so important, but so of course so are the readers. So you as the beauty editor had to make a story that satisfied the beauty advertiser but also the reader, and I think that's how I learnt that very fine line between content and commerciality that I see nowadays is disappearing. And I think it's a dreadful shame, and it will be the death of media if they can't find a happy compromise between the two of them. None of us can exist without the commerce, we all understand that, but the reader ultimately is always the most important person. I loved the creative process and that stood me in very good stead later on when I was actually the boss, because I'd done all the little work down the bottom, so I knew what it was like on the front line, and I knew that you'd get a new business manager in who had all these great, what they thought were great ideas. What you would say, I know what the personalities are like on a shoot. I know what models are like or photographers are like, and you can't just do it on a spreadsheet. You can't McKinsey it. I listened, I observed, and I in effect became a diplomat, which is what I would say was the majority of my job for a really long time. I eventually moved back. Nancy had by that time become the editor-in-chief. She was fired. It just happens at Vogue. This sort of frog march, they just fire you out. It's really weird. I don't know why they don't want to just exit out people nicely, but it's high profile. And I went back. I was going back to deputy, but it happened while I was basically in the air. So I went back to Sydney. And there was, I don't know if anybody remembers, there was an English editor that came in at the time, and there was a different management, and I wasn't really, I do believe that if management isn't right, you're really not going to succeed, and if you stay there for too long, you'll go down with a sinking ship. So I jumped ship and I went to Harper's Bazaar as the deputy, and we launched Harper's Bazaar very successfully, because it later became my biggest rival. I'm like, damn, I did that in the first place. But freelance was great, but I loved going back to an office because I absolutely love the camaraderie of an office. So the months that I spent working at Vogue when it was not doing so well, and then the months that I'd spent at Bazaar when we launched it, he'd been in Australia once before, but we launched it, they were probably, in retrospect, where I learnt my most valuable lessons in publishing, because when you work for brands that are esteemed as Vogue or Harper's Bazaar, it's very much highlighted how crucial it is to maintain a standard of consistency and an integrity of purpose that flows through every area of the business. And that is from the stationery, well, we don't have stationery anymore mostly, do we? But even like the business card, to the sales presentation, to the September issue, to the flowers on the table, to the envelope that you sent, to the thank you card. Everything had to reflect the brand, and the people you hired had to reflect the brand. You can't just say we're Vogue and then not act it. You actually have to walk the talk. There also has to be a long-term vision that's shared, and this is good for any business, obviously, whether it's a new business like you spoke about before, or something that's established as a Vogue. There has to be a long-term vision that is shared by every single member of the staff. And rather than this will do now, we'll make budget now, this is going to be good for me, it's a great tear sheet for me, I'll make budget, I'll get my commission, who cares if we sold out? That's not going to sustain a business for a long time. And you also, I believe, can't make a business using freelancers. I think that everybody has to feel part of, you can use some freelancers, But I think everybody has to feel part of a team and have a common goal and a common purpose. You can only achieve success by employing the right people. That's the ultimate takeaway that you've got. Luxury brands are very precarious, and every single person thinks they know how to run one, believe me, because I've heard every single opinion. Very few people know how to do. While super brands like Vogue appear to be unassailable, I witness firsthand that they're not. They're also an irresistible magnet to frauds and wannabes and people who want to get higher up the social ladder, and they require constant vigilance. I remember, because as I said, I had 8 CEOs, in various orders, management decided, Vogue was going bad. Why don't we cast off our elitist notions and we'll do the middle area as well. Maybe we'll do mass as well. Wouldn't that be lucrative? Wouldn't that be great? And I would hear it many times as newcomers came in. I would hear a lot of theories from their wives, who probably didn't even read Vogue, but I got to benefit from their opinions. Lucky me. And I had to try and draw a line because I knew it was a giant mistake to dangerously and drastically redraw the borders of a luxury brand. A luxury brand is a luxury brand, and it needs to stay iconic, and it needs to have parameters. Corinne, who was the editor of Bazaar at the time, we shared the same sensibilities. I was there only for 22 months, and then Vogue, the managing director and what have you, were all moved out, and the new managing director hired me as editor, and I went back. And in a delicious and ironic twist, Nancy, who'd been fired, was back as well in the office of this same guy that had fired her, so we loved that. We painted it orange because that's the colour of intelligence. I would never have considered returning to Vogue if I didn't believe in the new management. As I said before, the best masthead in the world doesn't mean anything if you haven't got the right people in charge. And at Vogue, you're under a very strong microscope, and you have to be better and faster and smarter. So we set on that path of turning it around. Robin got in, everything from feng shui, because so many people had been fired in the corner office. She feng shuied the building, but whether you believe it in or not, it made everybody feel like we were trying to open up lines of communication, and it wasn't about belief, it was about that management wanted a new, fresh look at things. Every time we got a new ad page, we would all celebrate together. It certainly was a very inclusive environment. It did mean when I went in, I did have to terminate a lot of people's employments, and because having the right staff was crucial, and that was, obviously anybody's had to do it. It's the worst thing that you have to do, but you have to get the right staff. Luckily for something like Vogue, people will take a pay cut to work at Vogue because it isn't the money that motivates them, it's the creativity and it's the work. But I did have to make sure that I had a detector for people who just wanted to be in it for the glamour or the personal glory, because it is the best calling card in the world. And the potential to exploit it is huge. So we needed to be, and it's something that I always instilled in the people that work for me, to be more polite, more humble, less grasping, more professional than anybody else, in the industry. I remember when we went back, it seems so old-fashioned now, the CEO, probably the COO would throw you out, but we spent like 20 minutes discussing which Royal Dalton we'd get for the boardroom. But to start, we had to start from the boardroom up so that the clients understood that we knew what we were talking about and that we represented the brand. The culture is everything. The culture of your company is everything, and you have to spend as much time on that as human resources to make sure that that resonates with the audience and the public and the client that you take that to. That's why we charge a premium for the ad page, because everything that we didn't cut corners. There was thought behind it. I loved working in publishing because I loved motivating creatives, because it was only ever about the work. You only had to have one idea in a meeting and everybody gets so excited and they'd go home and have 100 ideas afterwards. It was never about a bonus or money or I can't be bothered or I need overtime. It was never about that. And I think another lesson I learned very early on was that there were going to be people, you should hire people always that are better than you, and certainly better than you in various areas. So I never considered myself to be omniscient, or, often people think the editor of Vogue is. I'd be like, you were supposed to know about manners and politics and clothes. And she's like, whoa, the weather, but surround yourself with people who know more than you. They're only going to make you look better. And listen to them. Hire people who push back. I don't really understand hiring people or frightening people. I think that you should have someone who's got particularly your art director or your fashion director needs to have a very strong opinion and push back on you and say, no, you're wrong. Ultimately, I'll make the decision. Ultimately, I'll take the responsibility because, circulation and profit was my responsibility. But I loved having those teams. And if you give them that amount of space, you'll get loyalty. I don't like to micromanage. I don't always like short meetings a good meeting. No meeting is a good meeting in my books. But, I never micromanaged. I was much more of a big picture person. And the only really thing I needed to do was, and Robin was really good at it as well, was with creatives. Creatives are quite needy about, you just got to tell them that you love their work and how amazing they are to have come up with that idea. Not necessarily because it will lead to money coming in and somebody else will be happy about that, the CFO or whatever, but you've got to thank the creative who isn't thinking about money. They're just thinking about moving your business forward. I think later, as under the times that publishing is going through with the introduction with digital and social media and advertising, there's so many reasons that publishing's under pressure. And we had a lot of new managers coming in because we were under license. We weren't owner-operated, and I think that, after we were not owner-operated, it changed a lot because you got a lot of people in who didn't truly understand the DNA of the culture. And when the managers come in, the staff were made to feel like they weren't trying hard enough. And that was really much more a question of disillusioned owners who hadn't done enough due diligence, as it was that the staff weren't trying. The staff kept trying harder and harder and harder and changing with the times. And I do remember one day there was one of those brainstorming sessions, where you all go somewhere, and I put my hand up and said, why don't you bonus creatives as well as ad salespeople? And you can imagine how that went down. But the creativity behind the business is that goose that lays the golden egg. So it was something I was fiercely protective about. It wasn't really until recent times that we started to see huge major contents costs and staff heads. They call them heads, which is the worst thing ever. They're not heads, they're all amazing talents. And I always only ever saw the editorial teams being positive and ready to do better. And across the board, I think the greatest danger in publishing now is that the creatives are losing their inspiration. Once Robin left, she moved to Condé Nast Russia. Bless her, she loved a challenge. That was not easy. But I stayed under various managers after that, and I found the easiest way to get through when new management came in was just to go back to the work, go back to your staff, spend your time with the clients and the readers, don't politic too much. I think it's a terrible waste of emotional energy to manage up. I know you have to a certain degree, but not constantly, and depends with who. I think it's important to stay transparent and to just do the work to the best of your ability and do it better and harder and faster. But perception played a lot of, actually a really ludicrous part in my career, because being the editor of Vogue, people would be like, oh, but she's terrifying, and they hadn't met me. Or, she's a snob, but they hadn't met me. And I had to do a lot of sort of overcompensation for what the brand says that the person is going to be. So I spent a lot of time doing that in management. When I look back, I think that was, energy that could have gone elsewhere, but had to be done. Then research came in. Because so many of the new management that came in really didn't understand the brand themselves. But instead of asking the teams that work for them, they would go out and get research. Now, I'm a believer in research. I'm more in a believer in research that can tell you what was wrong, what didn't work. Why no? Sales will tell you that as well. But research can tell you one thing, but and negative things. But I'd rather hear it come from a reader, to tell you the truth. And I had a lot of opinions that I had to deal with at Vogue. Because the brand's such a lovely, evocative brand, everybody feels very included, very what's the word? That they're part of the family, particularly if they're the reader. So they're very verbose with their opinions and want to share them. But I always paid attention to the negative ones. If I would get them from a reader, positive, whatever, that's fine. But negative was always important to me. But we did have, after I don't know how many CEOs and research I'd get a series of normally male managers, I would have to say, with the worst shoes you've ever seen, saying, no, look, we've done this research and women like pink. And you'd be like, is that right? women like shoes. We probably paid $250,000 to work out women like shoes. And then I got one directive once that women couldn't read a page of type unless you put a picture in the middle of it. You couldn't get a whole page of copy. They like cover lines that say 127 things. I mean, just nonsense that I would have to sit in meetings and go, yeah, oh, amazing. It was absolutely brain-numbing. And then you would actually get people, anybody that came in and was from the UK would immediately tell you that everything needed to be shot at the beach because it was just, in a water taxi in Sydney Harbour. It was like, and then I remember probably towards the end, we were sitting around a table and one of the ad reps said to me, they were going to chop 16 pages of editorial out of the magazine. It was a very small book. And I said, well, obviously I would fight tooth and claw not to do that. She said, I don't think the reader would notice 16 pages chopped out of their editorial. So that's what, you dealt with when you got too many people trying to have an opinion. And I remember even with covers, I would stop it I'd vox pop it for around 2 or 3, and then you have to stop because otherwise you get people saying, I think she looks beautiful, I think she looks mean, she looks like the girl who stole my boyfriend, she looks like my cousin. And I remember one of the juniors in the art department saying to me, just stop asking because when you mix all colours together you get brown. And it's true. So you really have to go with your gut, go with your art director and your fashion director's gut. I used to always ask my PA because she was sort of the average reader who wasn't that fashiony, she just knew what she liked. And you kind of got to stop it there. In the end, I was always going to be the one who made the decision because ultimately I would have to take the responsibility. If it was a success, there'd be tons of fathers, but if it failed, I would take the responsibility. And as an editor, 13 years and however many issues that is, down the track, I was only ever going to be as good as my last cover. The pressure from advertisers can't be underestimated, and especially nowadays. The commercial imperative, I've touched on it before, but it's obvious. It's always been there, but there is an intelligent path, I feel, through the middle where you can please them. But they push so hard, and if you have managers or ad managers with a lack of long-term brand vision, they would try to force you to cross the line. And then, of course, the advertising world started to turn to bloggers. They were pushing us very hard and then would come to us and say, well, we're going to put our money with bloggers now because they've got an independent voice and they tell the truth, which is such a delicious irony because we had been fighting them on the integrity issue the whole way. And then, of course, the bloggers, because they didn't have independent income, were some of the first ones to sell out entirely if they could get a mention on their thing. So that whole thing is going through huge processes of change at the moment between traditional media and bloggers and working out who's on the payola and who isn't and who truly does have an independent voice through the middle. And that's up for discussion, constantly on an hourly basis, really. It isn't social media or the internet that I think is the biggest challenge for fashion publishing. And on the contrary, they're just wonderful additions to help you spread a brand and your message across multimedia platforms. And I don't see the end of magazines. Cirque hadn't dropped off the last issue that I had in fact had a 3% increase. But I also see many things on top of magazines to reflect your brand. I see books. I see coffee table, beautiful, more expensive books. I see apps, I see websites, I see tweets, I see Tumblrs, I see Instagrams, I see Vimeo, I see television shows, I see product lines, I see restaurants, I see bars. There's so much you can put around a brand. But the biggest challenge is to ensure that the products and the talent behind them remain on brand. And to me, this is the paramount thing, to make sure that you've established a brand and you have a point of view and everything that revolves around it reflects it and continues to reiterate it and not just sell it out or try to cross-platform it for a cheap, you'll get 300,000 hits over there, but is it the right place for you to get those 300,000 hits? Excuse me. The pressures are not external at the moment. I don't see them so much as external. I think they're more internal. The reduction of contents costs, the reduction of crucial staff, the pressure to use reappropriated material where if you've got something like a Vogue, you can pick up stuff that's been shot in American Vogue or French Vogue or whatever and just reappropriate it. You're not having an original startup process, which I think is cheating a reader. using lifts. Well, that's what they are. Sorry, using handouts in the magazine. I see this happening in magazines where it's a press handout. It's just regurgitated. Staff Instagrams. I mean, Instagram's not photography. Instagram's Instagram, but photographers do have a very special purpose if you're putting together a beautiful product. Using interns instead of training your young staff. Everyone's just using interns and not paying them, and they're letting them literally make pages. And you know, I think that's a big shortchange. Cutting locations. We used to go to the most beautiful locations and spend 6 days. I mean, I understand the commerce around that, but now you're lucky to get into a studio for half a day. Cutting pages, as I said before, analytics, where you analyse which pages bring in more money, and then you try to make your book, juggle your book to make that size. Ridiculous. Asking what they want on Facebook, on the cover. If you're a super brand, I think you should lead and you should inspire and you should innovate and not collate what Facebook readers think they might want to see. Delivering an ameliorated product and then shortchanging the reader is, to me, the biggest threat that publishing's facing. There are tiers of middle management whose salaries are making it necessary to fire the creative stylists. And the magic in the magazine from those little girls that were making $45,000, $50,000 a year who worked till they dropped. And that was the fun and the best. That was, to me, the magic, because I was one of those girls, and in fact I started on 28, I think. But they were the ones that, you know, always drove that brand forward. And I don't want to get nostalgia for the old days, you know, everything was better, but that needs to stay in whatever's coming, whatever is now, and whatever comes next. I was editor. 2009 was 50th anniversary of Vogue, and I co-wrote a book with Lee Tulloch about the 50 years of Vogue, and we threw this tremendous party, and Bernard Laser got up, who had founded Vogue in 1959, and he got up and did a speech. He's now in his 80s, and he's a wonderful gentleman, and I was very tuned into him, and I hope the rest of the audience heard him, because he said the way he founded the magazine was that he thinks that you should do quality work first and the profits will come afterwards, and I still believe that. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. I like the idea of surrounding yourself with people better than yourself, and perhaps
and better looking.
Yeah, and that's perhaps an area maybe where women are better at doing that than men, I think.
Maybe.
That's just my view. And I know there are questions. I'd like to ask just one, getting down to the nitty-gritty of photoshopping and digital enhancing and that type of thing with the covers of your magazines and the photographs in the magazines. Do you ever think we'll get to a more realistic portrayal once again of women in those pages?
That's a huge topic. It depends on, because everybody always assumes that at magazines you Photoshop, especially with the weight issue. Everybody thinks that you Photoshop models to look thinner. But in fact, most of the time the models are so thin to start with, because that's coming from catwalk trends and runway trends and getting into sample sizes. We often have to fatten them up. So we will often fill in, they get really thin here.
Yes, gaunt.
Like any woman, you can't spot reduce. So say a girl's a bit hippie, she diets and it all falls away from here and here. So we would often Photoshop to put weight on. The girls that we're dealing with don't really have, they're not that much, they're not older. So you'd be surprised there's less photoshopping. You do more photoshopping to the clothes and to make creases come out and things like that than you do to actually change the ability. But you've got so many people working on one model with the lighting, the hair, the makeup.
They get it right.
You kind of get it right. But I know what you're saying. Will there be a less idealised form of beauty? If the reader demands it. But at the moment, the reader still demands quite
perfection.
I don't think that they want them to be as thin as they are. I don't.
No.
But they do demand a certain amount of perfection and non-scariness. You know, that they do still like models to be engaging and happy. You know,
have a
someone you might want to sit down and talk to. Like it has to be consumer led, because the industry just won't change. It doesn't, and it won't.
Yeah, and now you've got a lot of power in that, of course, as a magazine editor. But
well, you do, but there's power that comes from other areas, like from the designers, from the casting agents overseas. A lot of it. There is actually really a group of people internationally who control who are the top 10 models, what's happening, who
What
are the
the
top
look
10
is.
style. Yeah, absolutely. And as an Australian Vogue Australian magazine, you really, you're playing in that pool of people, but there's more power with the designers and the big design houses as well than just magazine editors.
Understand. Mari, did you have a question?
Just would love to know what's next for you.
Well, I'm going to write some more books. Because I really enjoyed that process. I was always a journalist, but when I was an editor, I didn't write very much because I always thought that you had to let the magazine speak for you. But I really enjoyed the process of writing the Vogue Factor, and it's seen a little bit of international success as well. So I have another book that I'm going to write before Christmas. So and we'll have 2 more actually. So I'm doing consulting as well, but books are very intensive. So for the moment, I'm going to be an author for the moment, yeah.
And of course, we've got the Vogue Factor available today here, and Kirstie's willing to sign for you as well. She'll be just on the exit, on the way out, at a table where she can sign the book for you. Great Mother's Day present. A lot of mothers and daughters. It's cross-generational, isn't it?
Yes, very mothers and daughters, yes.
Other questions?
Interested in the age of the models that are being used, who seem increasingly younger. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I had a very strong opinion on that about a few years ago. Probably about 2009, I think. No, it might have been earlier. I was offered a girl. We were shooting girls that were 14 and 15 sometimes. And then I remember being offered a girl that I was bringing out for Fashion Week who was just turned 14. And, I just had a moment as a mother, as a woman, and just said, this is ridiculous. And this is not a big deal, but I just said no one can be under the age of 16. So we don't shoot anybody under there. And we'd be sent girls who you could see had potential at 14 or 15, but we'd just keep an eye on them until they had their 16th birthday. To me, that's a no-brainer. And we did that ages ago. I mean, could it be older? Could it be higher than that? Potentially. But, there are very beautiful, mature-looking girls at 17. I think they have to be absolutely over 16 because you're selling clothes to women. You're not selling clothes to little girls. But it's also how young they look and how you photograph them. You don't ever want them to look vulnerable or afraid or very young. So, a really beautiful 17-year-old can look 23 just because of makeup and what have you. But it's not specific to the age. 16 plus, of course, but it's not. It's the image itself and how does that look? And does she look overly sexualised, etc., etc. Yeah.
But if an agency came to you and said, I've got the most beautiful 25-year-old, so young, would you have a look?
Oh, sure.
You would?
Oh, yeah. There's lots of girls making comebacks now at like 37 and that's changing a lot. Yeah. Caroline Murphy's just come back 38. That's pretty good.
That's excellent.
That's catwalk.
And I think it's relatable for all the women in this room to see clothing on an age that they can relate to. So it's a very good point.
I think it's changed. I do. I think there are definitely some more mature models coming through. And then, we did shoot Robin Lawley in terms of size. Robin's a size 14, but she's 6 foot tall, so she should be really, shouldn't she? And with bosoms and everything. But I got great feedback from that.
I remember that.
From readers, amazing feedback. And it wasn't sort of a tokenistic, we've got a plus size model on the cover. I didn't put her on the cover. I just put her in a fashion story and didn't even really mention it. Like just sort of said, "This lovely Robin Lawley," and I got incredible feedback from that. So it is changing a little bit. But
did that cause a change? Did that make
it hasn't caused anything because if you've just seen because Robin's quite special as well. Not everybody looks like Robin.
Yes.
But if you just look at Australian Fashion Week, Sydney Fashion Week, you saw the size of the models there. There was great, furore about that because they've gone back to being Paris skinny again. So it's an ongoing problem that has to be ultimately solved by the consumer. Because if you don't buy it or you don't buy it or you complain about it then, and if they're not making money, then they're going to change.
Absolutely, of course. Sorry.
You mentioned that you've lost over the years advertisers to bloggers, and it's no secret that advertisers are now starting to spend more money in the digital space. With that in mind, what's your take on the future of print advertising future of magazines, given that magazines and the print industry can't really survive without people spending money on print ads? Yeah,
it's a very, how long is a piece of string? We could talk for an hour, but there's still a lot of immersion in print advertising. Consumers spend a lot of time going into an ad in print digital advertising often passes them by. There's not the great level of connection on digital than there is in a print product. So what you need to have is multi-platform, so that there is a print arm to the advertiser's business and then a digital one as well, and whether it's with apps or click through and buy or what, there are so many commercial prospects to that. So it's about making your brand have multi-leverage opportunities. But what everybody just thought the money would go directly from print into digital, it isn't, because advertisers are not necessarily putting their digital money into a magazine's website. They put it into their own website and create e-commerce, and then actually do editorial on their own website. So they're changing the whole dynamic. Instead of having a magazine and having traditional advertisers, you can take a magazine to the advertiser. So the whole thing is in a state of change. So bloggers, for me, bloggers are better to be the editorial people at a brand as opposed to a blog, because the money isn't there. Is that a complicated way of saying it? But
complicated, but
yeah,
I do understand what you mean.
The immersion in print is important. You have to have a digital arm. A lot of that digital money is going to go into the brand. So Vuitton, for example, we're going to put a lot of money into their site as opposed to somebody else's site. So it's an ongoing conversation. Like, it just changes daily. But print, if you've got a good print magazine, if you look something like Frankie, who's, it stays very close to what it is, it just keeps going up in circ. And it's got digital, but it isn't a digital, the whole thing isn't a digital prospect. People love that magazine because it's so tactile.
Okay. Thank you. We have a lady here. Yes.
Thank you. Hope that's on.
I can hear you.
I was interested in your comment about content versus commercialism. How did you end up balancing that in your articles?
Well, usually the content, the commercialism, the client was somebody that your reader would want to know about. So as long as they were giving you a good opportunity, so say, for example, it was Vuitton and they were going to give you an interview with Marc Jacobs, that's a win-win, because the reader wants to hear what Marc Jacobs has to say. It was probably when you get advertisers that are not particularly your catchment area and they're making very big demands about the stories that they want to see and how they want them written, and you don't see that there's a lot of relevance to your reader. And then doing deals beforehand where it was promised. I don't believe in that. I think that you say you're a great client. I understand you're a great client. Let me look at your products. Let's work our way through this. But I don't believe in doing deals beforehand that are sight unseen, so that you say, we'll do what you want because we want your business. We can all come to a happy agreement. Show me what your product is and we'll make a really great story for the reader. That's the main thing. Always put the reader in the equation, because they can tick the box that they got the page, but was it interesting? So that was huge dance. Yeah.
Anybody else have a question? Because we've got to wrap up very shortly.
You mentioned when you were talking that the front page was, or your cover was important. I just wondered how much importance was on that. Did that impact circulation for that month in a great way, or was it just about brand?
No, that was because it's changing a little bit, but like America, for example, they're completely subscription driven. So their front cover would give them I'm pulling a figure out, but say 10% up or down on newsstand. But for a long time in Australia, we're completely dependent on newsstand sales, and we only had a small proportion of subs. We gradually got subs up to a very significant amount, and that's every editor's dream, because you don't have to worry so much. You just got to worry about consistency. But you could live or die by a cover. If it died at the newsstand, you could have a decline of 30% if it was a bad cover, for sure. Yeah.
And final question, someone from this side of the room.
What's the best issue that, I guess, from a circulation point of view, what was your best issue? And personally, what do you think was your best issue? Because they're probably different.
Yeah. Princess Mary was our biggest circ. And I was very personally proud of that issue, because that was a scoop and everything. But in terms of creative cover, the Cate Blanchett 50th that was illustrated. Do you remember the 4 illustrated covers and one of them came in a box? Like, I personally loved that execution, because I felt it took the history and brought it into now with Cate, and I love Cate and David Down. I mean, I loved that. But Princess Mary was our biggest sale ever. Yeah. And in fact, there was a whole bunch. They went to Copenhagen, and then it was in London on their way to Copenhagen, and then the storehouse burnt down. So there are hardly any issues with circulating. So if you ever see them on eBay, they're quite rare because a whole bunch of them got burnt.
Do you have copies of all the magazines in your era?
No. I did have them all in a box in my office, but I don't look backwards.
No.
I never look backwards.
That's good advice too.
So I didn't even take them with me.
I think lovely pearls of wisdom and things we can definitely contemplate and stew on after hearing Kirstie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Kirstie.
you very much.